So I'm Robin. I'm currently doing a PhD at SOAS through the University of London. Some of you might recognize me though, because I used to work at WaterAid in the policy team. So I worked on the Wash Watch project and also on WaterAid's health portfolio. So I'm really excited to be back at WaterAid because I really missed you guys for that year and a bit, definitely. And I've been in conversation with Eric Harvey from PSU about collaborating with WaterAid on my research for some time now. So the point of today's presentation is to walk you through what my research is all about, why it's important, why it's timely, and what's in it for WaterAid by participating. So I'm going to start with my research question and kind of take you on a journey as to how I got to this research question. So my research question is, how are moral norms understood and applied by Northern international NGOs in development practice? And I'll answer this research question by doing an in-depth case study of WaterAid. Before we dive into things though, I just want to walk you through some key research framing and terminology. So I've already said that I'm specifically interested in Northern international NGOs and those that are specifically seeking long-term poverty alleviation goals. So WaterAid is a good case in this context. Some definitions here, don't worry, they'll become a lot more clearer by the end of the presentation, but they're kind of like the underpinning ideas behind my research. So the first one is the idea of legitimacy. So legitimacy is a generalized perception or assumption that the actions of an entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate within some socially constructed system of norms, values, definitions, or beliefs. All right? The other important thing for my research project is about applied ethics. And because I'm interested in applied ethics, I make a distinction between terms morals and ethics. So in philosophy, a lot of times these words are used synonymously to mean the same thing. But in the context of my research, morals are established notions of what is good or right, whereas ethics is the practical application of established morals. So to act ethically is to act in accordance with morals. Make sense? Okay, so working at WaterAid, I'm sure you're all aware of the growth in organizational and influential capacity that NGOs have enjoyed over recent years. So if we take a look at organizational capacity, NGOs are definitely gaining increasing access to finance. So this graph just shows you the amount of official development assistance channeled through NGOs over 1980 to 2013. And there's definitely a steep incline here. If we think about NGOs' influential capacity, they're also gaining increasing access to both international and national level policy fora. So think about the SDGs. NGOs have been specifically identified as key stakeholders in achieving global goal success. If we think about the MDGs, that wasn't the case at first. So over time, the influential voice of NGOs has grown. Also, it's not uncommon for NGOs to have access to the poverty reduction strategy papers of the countries in which they work with. So definitely have enjoyed growth and success over recent years, but why? So most of the reasons are really complex, but most of the literature that looks at explaining the proliferation of NGOs takes a political economy perspective, which identifies changing policy context which allowed for their proliferation. And this is where my research comes in. I've essentially identified a gap in the literature. I'm saying, yes, political economy is important, but there's something else that's been driving the growth and success of NGOs as well. And that something else is NGOs' strong moral legitimacy. So strong moral legitimacy has definitely been an overlooked concept for NGOs, and it's something that's quite important and needs attention now. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll agree. So let me take you through this. Back to our definition of legitimacy. So within organizational theory, there are different types of legitimacy that an organization can have. The three most prominent ones are pragmatic, cognitive, and moral legitimacy. And these different types of legitimacy are essentially what inform the some socially constructed system of norms part of the legitimacy definition. So let me just put this in context by walking you through it a little more. So pragmatic legitimacy, for example, rests on self-interested calculations of an organization's most immediate audience. So Marks and Spencer's or any other corporate would be a good example of an organization that primarily has pragmatic legitimacy. Cognitive legitimacy stems from comprehension, as in the organization is doing something that makes sense or is plausible, or taken for grantedness in that it plays an inevitable role within our society. So an example of this might be the government or a church. Lastly, moral legitimacy results from judgments of whether or not the organization in question is doing the right thing for the common good. And there is consensus amongst academics that work in organizational theory that NGOs do indeed primarily possess moral legitimacy. And I keep saying primarily because organizations tend to kind of possess a combination, but what they primarily possess is the most important for their legitimacy. And this slide is just to show that it's not just a bunch of academics saying this. If we take a look at some prominent Northern NGOs mission statements, it becomes quite clear that they are indeed speaking to this moral legitimacy idea. So I'll just read out action aids. They say, our mission is to work with poor and excluded people to eradicate poverty and injustice. So it's drawing on the idea of moral legitimacy, these types of statements. So NGOs primarily possess moral legitimacy. So what? Well, their moral legitimacy is particularly strong, and I can get at why I can say this in a minute. And it's essentially become a lucrative resource. It's a source for eliciting trust, speaking with authority, and securing staff and donor support. So I can say that NGOs' moral legitimacy is strong because concepts of legitimacy and the associated benefits an organization enjoys because they're seen to be legitimate are mutually reinforcing. So if you're a legitimate organization, you enjoy certain benefits, but because you also enjoy those benefits, then your legitimacy is further strengthened. So let's take a look at how some of this is working in practice. So this image here just shows that charities are the third most trusted organization or body within the UK public sphere. And this data is from 2008 to 2014. So charities are typically well-trusted organizations. And the moral nature of NGOs' legitimacy helps this. It's easy to trust someone or something that is motivated by altruistic reasons, sorry. Speaking with authority, yep, NGOs definitely do that now. Again, if we look at the growing access to international and national policy fora, I think that demonstrates that NGOs have an ability to speak with authority today. And the moral nature, again, plays a role in this. So because NGOs are typically value-driven and their authoritative voice is without any incentives or disincentives for compliance, it means that NGOs can speak with conviction and as a moral voice. And it's quite controversial to challenge a moral voice. It doesn't happen very often. And I think Stephen Hopgood really captured this well in his ethnographic study of Amnesty International when he said, when Amnesty takes a stand on a particular issue, its moral authority ensures that its condemnation hits home and cannot be ignored. Moving on to securing staff. I'm sure many of you in the room work for WaterAid for moral reasons. So there's a ton of research out there where people have talked to NGO practitioners about why they do what they do. And a lot of the time you'll hear people say things like, I wanted to save lives, or I wanted to make a difference, I want my work to be meaningful, etc., etc. So those are all moral motivations for doing what they do. And that's not the only reason, but it's definitely a component of why people work in the third sector. Also, if we think about donor support, at the level of individual giving, NGOs have traditionally tried to elicit a moral response in order to get money. That's what we're doing, making people react based on a moral reason to give money. And was anyone at the Soper Doper lunchtime talk last week? I thought it was really interesting. The speaker said, it seems like people care a lot more today than they did 10 to 15 years ago. And because of this, it's really important that we partner with the people that care, the people like you that work for WaterAid. So this is what the guy said in the presentation, which I thought was fascinating. Because corporates have essentially identified a strategic advantage to possessing some degree of moral legitimacy. And in order to secure it, they're partnering with NGOs because NGOs primarily have this moral legitimacy that they themselves now want to have a piece of. All right, so the moral of the story here, pun intended, is essentially NGOs' moral legitimacy is strong, and it plays an important role for NGOs' success as actors in development. Right, so if we go back to this definition of legitimacy, we've talked about this socially constructed system of norms, right? Because NGOs primarily possess moral legitimacy, it makes good sense that they're judged according to moral norms. And this slide is just to show that sector-wide moral norms already exist. So things like principles, values, duties, obligations, rights, those are all moral norms, or can be seen as moral norms. So this is just an example of what some sector-wide moral norms might be. These are the Paris principles that were adapted to a civil society organization perspective back in 2008. But there might be others. So for example, the principles that underpin the human rights-based approach to development would also be moral norms. And I hope you recognize these. These are WaterAid's values. So these would be institutional level moral norms. So just take stock one more time. We've said that NGOs primarily possess moral legitimacy. This legitimacy is strong and important for NGO success as actors in development, and sector-wide and institutional level moral norms exist. But despite their existence and importance, moral norms appear to not be well understood. And there's a bunch of different bits of evidence that kind of demonstrates this. And just as I go through it, keep in mind that my research question here is directly responding to this lack of understanding of NGO moral norms. So things like values, principles, moral norms, etc., aren't currently systematically monitored across the sector or traditionally reported on by NGOs. And just because that isn't happening doesn't mean that we can't start looking at process-type indicators, or we can't start reporting on these things. So it's more about, my research question is kind of about how do we elevate this and communicate these types of things. There's also emerging evidence that's bringing into question whether or not moral norms are realized in practice. So for example, there's bodies of literature that are looking at NGO accountability mechanisms. Are they primarily upwards or downwards? There's also literature looking at how aid is targeted by NGOs. Is it following principles of equity and based on need? And lastly, questions around NGOs being risk-taking and adaptable and innovative in practice. So this is the literature speaking. So this type of literature is emerging. One thing I want to point out here is that the narrative is associated with a lot of authors tend to go to, or tend to say something along the lines of, these challenges are presenting for NGOs because of the current relationships that exist between NGOs and big donors. So I thought this was quite an interesting thing that emerges out of the literature, and I wondered if a research project along these lines might be able to provide some sort of tangible output, such as a tool to help NGOs negotiate with donors and push back against anything that might threaten their moral legitimacy. Just an idea. And what else on this point? Oh yeah, the fact that this literature is emerging, it also demonstrates that there's an interest in understanding what moral norms mean in practice. So I think that gives voice to the relevance of this research project as well. So there's also a perception of moral norms being merely development buzzwords, and I'm not saying everyone feels this way, but there's a perception out there of them being merely buzzwords. And I think this comes back to the distinction I made earlier between morals and ethics. The moral side of things, like what are the morals, is really well communicated, but perhaps the ethics piece isn't as well communicated. So if we can start communicating the ethics piece, can we kind of thwart these misconceptions? Lastly, from a researcher perspective, there is limited moral lens within the existing NGO literature. So my research would be filling a research gap as well. So this lack of understanding hopefully brings us back to my research question and highlights why my research question is of interest. So as I said, I've been chatting with Eric and PSU about collaborating with WaterAid on this research project. And the idea is for me to be in the office 2 to 3 days a week until August. And the main questions I want to get at, so I've broken down my overarching question into a couple of sub-questions, is how are moral norms understood and applied by WaterAid? So this is at an institutional level. So for example, looking at how values might be communicated externally or how they're communicated internally across staff. And then after looking at the institutional level, I also want to look at the practitioner level. So how do WaterAid staff understand moral norms and apply moral norms? And the idea here is that, meaning is quite contextual. So what something might mean to me might mean something very different to you, and how I apply moral norms in practice because I work, say, in media versus how somebody working within PSU applies moral norms might be different. So looking at the two different layers there is really what's of interest to me. I'm going to be starting with sitting with PSU because Eric has invited me here. And while I'm with PSU, I'll be doing interviews, document and media review, and ethnographic observations in order to collect my data. And after I've sat with PSU for a couple of months, I'll do a focus group where I present my research findings back to the team, and then we have some discussion around anything that emerged that was particularly interesting. So now I'm just with PSU, but hopefully other teams will see value in this research project, and I'll be able to sit with other people while I'm here as well. So if anyone's interested in having me sit with their team, let me know. And perhaps most importantly, what's in it for WaterAid? I think the big pit here is around reputation and legitimacy. So the first or a crucial first step towards strengthening moral legitimacy is deepening our understanding of the nature of moral legitimacy and what these moral norms really mean. And if you can do that, then you're better equipped to respond to and reduce scrutiny. So this is directly advantageous to WaterAid, but it's also not just about WaterAid, it's about the wider sector as well. If the NGO sector is strong, then WaterAid is strong. If the NGO sector legitimacy is threatened, then WaterAid's legitimacy is threatened too. So it's sector level as well as specifically of interest to WaterAid. Also, WaterAid would be at the forefront of some new and innovative research that potentially has sector-wide implications. So my research is really kind of carving out a new way of deepening our understanding of moral norms. And I really do think that other NGOs are going to jump on board with this type of an understanding, primarily because there's a massive discourse of like doing development differently. Everybody's talking about doing development differently, can't do the business as usual. What distinguishes NGOs as actors in development? How do we maintain relevance, etc.? And I think the moral nature will be really important in that discussion moving forward. Lastly, just by participating in this research, WaterAid is demonstrating courage and a commitment to transparency and integrity. But WaterAid will also then have access to my research findings, which can be used for various different internal decision-making processes, and potentially also for the development of some interesting tangible outputs. So I've just put some ideas that I've had here that could potentially come out of this research. I already alluded to a tool for supporting negotiations with donors, and this tool would be grounded in looking for threats to moral legitimacy. Perhaps also a framework for guiding ethical decision-making, or the development of some sort of curriculum for supporting ethically aware and astute staff. And I've put any other ideas as well, because if you have any ideas, let me know. We can definitely add to this list. And if we extrapolate out from WaterAid for a minute, I've already alluded to the first two, so my research fills gaps, strengthening NGO legitimacy from like more of a sector perspective, but then also looking at improved performance. So there's literature out there that shows development projects that operate at a level of thick ethical context versus thin moral principles. So remember my distinction between the terms here, moral and ethics. Those that are working at thick ethical context level have better performance outcomes. And lastly, I think the NGO sector and just the nature of development work in and of itself is ripe for ethics. So we work within fiduciary relationships, we make morally sensitive decisions, we face moral dilemmas on a regular basis. So totally right for ethics. So I think this research also kind of like starts shifting us towards the direction of some sort of professional or applied ethics for the sector. Thanks. Any questions, comments, suggestions, queries?
Well, thank you very much. And what I wanted to know is like whether you have an aspect when we talk about moral legitimacy, because there's also quite a debate in the South about northern NGOs, which is especially your subject, and there's this debate about this new form of colonization. So whether you will explore these aspects in your research.
Well, I've definitely explored it in my literature, and it's one of the reasons for kind of looking at the ethics of development practice. Yeah, but I'm not going to be focusing on that as a research question or having any sort of research output that speaks to that debate at all. But I do think that debate gives cause for NGOs as a sector being interested in strengthening their moral legitimacy, because
because we're talking about social norms, so we think there is also, I mean, as much as I'm for what we do and everything, we also have to hear sometimes what we call a social legitimacy is under our social norms. So there is a clash in the South about that nowadays.
100%. So I mean, I'll get at that a little. I'm not going to comment on it at the end of my research project, but I'll definitely look at, because I'm looking at a practitioner level, moral norms will have different meanings to different people. And if we can elevate, there's different understandings of these things across country programs, that might be one way of doing it. So definitely, it's not just going to be like a UK-centric thing. I want to talk to people that are working in our CPs as well. Because that, to me, that's the thing. All these meaning is very contextualized and subjective to the individual. So yeah, I'll definitely try and flush that out. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry, Jacob.
I guess, my question was very similar to Phil's. You discussed what you believe the responsiveness to your research will be on a sector-wide level and then also on a WaterAid level. And I was just wondering what you think the responsiveness will be in terms of like a non-northern, non-western kind of academia level and NGO level. And you mentioned there at the end that you intend to discuss, or you'd like to talk with staff from CPs. I think that will open up that kind of that area. But how do you think your research will kind of impact the sector, outside of the western and northern spheres?
Yeah, well.
Or if it's not meant to, it's not meant to. That's fine.
So I guess maybe I should say why I specifically am looking at northern international NGOs. So the reason I'm specifically interested in them is because they're seen to be the most removed from beneficiaries geographically, politically, and culturally. So from my perspective, northern international NGOs were interesting to look at because of the potential complexity of moral dilemmas they might face in comparison to a southern-based NGO or a local NGO. So I get that for sure, but I've just decided to focus on perhaps the most complex case.
And then I guess a follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
My other question is, why did you end up choosing just WaterAid as a case study as opposed to Oxfam?
So
or maybe it's not just one.
Well, so because my research is a case study. Case study research is typically an in-depth analysis of one unit. So one NGO is legitimate for case study research. The other reason why WaterAid also fits this well is because we don't really work in a humanitarian context. So if I went to Oxfam or SAVE, they kind of do humanitarian and poverty alleviation. So which would be a little bit more, all of that work is really muddled together and hard to separate. So going into one of those organizations, it would be hard to identify what is the poverty alleviation moral norms driving work versus what is the humanitarian sector moral norms driving work. Because within the humanitarian sector, there's a massive discourse of ethics already. So they've got the Red Cross principles. Hugo Slim, this academic, has done tons of work around ethics. They've got the Sphere standards and the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership that supports the Sphere standards. So it was also the sense that humanitarian discourse of ethics is way more progressed than the poverty alleviation side. And for purposes of analysis, it's easier to work at an NGO that isn't kind of doing both types of work. Yeah. Any questions online?
Yeah.
John?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I was sorry, I missed the beginning, so you may have covered some of this, but I was just interested. I think there was one aspect you were saying that where you had sort of thicker, was that the term, thicker ethics, or rather than sort of the thinner side, you think there could be improved performance. And I was just, because I could imagine, for example, an NGO that was didn't have strong ethics was ready to sort of fund it from whatever source happened to turn up, that they could, they might sort of build their income, and therefore you could imagine that there's a sort of improved performance aspect to that. I just wondered, I think, as I understand it, you're suggesting that actually where the ethical side is very strong, that you're going to get improved performance. Maybe you could just say a little bit more about that, and if there's any examples you've got, I'd be interested.
So I guess I had given definitions here. So morals, so the literature I'm referring to about thin moral principles versus thick ethical context kind of gets at this distinction I've made between the terms morals and ethics. So morals are established notions of what is right or good, and ethics is actually how you put that into practice. What does that look like in practice? So the research that I was referring to there, they looked at a bunch of different development projects some were working at a level of what he termed thin moral principles. So they had the moral principles. They were saying we're going to be empowering women, or we're being adaptable in practice, blah, blah, blah. But that's all they said. They said they were doing that, and it was in the project proposal, but there was no tool to support the actual realization of that in practice, and there was no indicators looking at those moral norms coming out in the end of the project. So he saw that actually if you kind of break it down as to what this looks like in practice and have some sort of way of kind of monitoring it in the end, it doesn't have to be like rigorous monitoring, but some kind of way or an incentive to look at it at the end of the project, they were actually having better project outcomes than those that just kind of had a level of abstract morality built in. Does that answer your question? Margaret?
Interesting one. You use the word performance, do you? It's the impact that you're looking for. In a WaterAid sense, we would say the impact of how we impact our unique contribution, our performance. Interesting, I think there's a different connotation, isn't it? And on the linguistics, I just know if we're getting a bit tight. We've spoken before, we're getting tied up in words, because to me, just applying it to WaterAid context, our morals are our values, our value statements.
Yeah.
And the way we apply our value statements is through our ethics, which is our ethical check.
Yeah.
That just seems to me how we do it. So we do have an ethical check.
For sure.
I think some of your suggestions there about whether, part of staff induction, that's part of what we do, that there are these boundaries, this is our ethical check, these are the standards we judge ourselves against and our partners. But if you ask WaterAid staff, what are the morals of the organisation, you'll get one answer. If you ask them what are the values of the organisation, that's quite deeply embedded, I would hope.
Yeah. So you're right. I think it is a language thing. And when I talk to staff about moral norms, I'm using the language that's relevant. So if I'm asking about WaterAid values, I'm saying values. I'm not going to say moral norms. But the reason I've said moral norms is because there's so much kind of falls under that. Principles follow under that. Values follow under that. Rights language falls under that. So from a research perspective, by keeping it as moral norms, it just gives me more scope of looking at things just beyond WaterAid values. So, for example, I might talk to somebody about sector strengthening because some of the Paris principles come into that piece of work we're doing. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, yeah. I just had, there was another point I was going to make actually. It's right at the beginning. You talked about why NGOs have grown because of this moral legitimacy. I just wonder if you're looking at counterfactuals, because I would suggest that an increase in distrust in institutions has enabled a void for NGOs to grow because people distrust institutions.
Yep.
Or the converse is that because with the MDG SDG conversation, I would suggest there it's because the institutions are more open. So in 2000 and the late 90s, the institutions, particularly the UN, weren't that, they were deciding MDGs in a little room in the basement of the UN. Whereas now the institutions, whether it's through NGO impact or not, have become much more open. So they were seeking CSO, NGO, INGO conversation, the people's conversation for the SDGs. So it's counterfactual is what's happened to other institutions, not just what's happened to NGOs and supposing that they've increased moral authority.
For sure. So I guess the thing there is I'm not saying that it's just moral legitimacy. I've identified that most of the discourse is along the lines of what you say. It's taking the political economy perspective of why NGOs have seen success and growth. So I'm not saying that moral legitimacy is the only factor or the most important factor. I'm just saying it is a factor that hasn't been looked at very much. And the other thing I should say is that when you spoke about we have values and then we have an ethical check and then we have this, I'm not saying that, I think the applied ethics exists already. It's just about how do we elevate it and communicate it out externally. That's what I want to look at. And there's probably tons of different systems of ethics at play at WaterAid. So try to get a comprehensive understanding of what it actually looks like across the organization and how staff understand and interact with them would be of great value, I think. Anyways. Wait, Simon, you had a question, right?
Yeah, it's interesting on how you bring it down from that kind of abstract level to the. So I'm sure, I joined WaterAid for partly for moral reasons. I'm sure a lot of people here did, and yet I still, when I look at my mid-year review or my performance appraisal, I've got to say, how have you lived the values this year? So there is clearly a gap between and actually how you bring that down. Are you looking at some of the research that's been done around private sector subjects? I know we like to think we have a kind of a monopoly on morality, but with everything that went on in the financial crisis, there's a lot of research around banks and commercial entities, and how they can, because actually 90% of people are at least not bad, and how those kind of not bad people ended up doing bad things, and how you get from these kind of principles that, because banks have values the same as we do, and probably most of their employees would agree with them, but ended up was directly contradictory. So you look at that research and how they're trying to improve that getting down from these values to these actions.
No, I haven't, but maybe that sounds like I should, so I will. Yeah. If you have any suggestions for readings on that, I will. But I've looked at other sectors in the development of professional ethics. I have a health background, so I'm well aware of medical ethics, health ethics, biomedical ethics, etc. So I've looked at that. How did ethics evolve in those sectors to figure out how could it potentially happen here? But that's getting at something really practical rather than a research project. So might be something I'd do later in life, though. And just one more thing I want to say is I think when you talked about my performance review, and I'm like, oh, this again, how did I demonstrate the values? I think that that happens. So I think it's worthwhile figuring out that's why I'm interested in the institutional versus the practitioner level, because if we can figure out what those gaps are, we can start to creatively think how to align them more.
Hi, that was really interesting, and I'm on the fundraising side of things, so coming at it from the perspective of some of the people that we're talking to about WaterAid, and I was quite reassured to see that charities are still high up there on the levels of trust, because the perspective that we've got is that trust levels are actually going down in charities and NGOs amongst the public. So I just wonder whether trust levels are falling in general, but also just to say that I think this research will be really useful for us in the fundraising teams, because we'll be able to go to our donors and show that we've actually had the courage to scrutinise ourselves. And so from our perspective, that's really interesting as well. And also finding new ways that we can actually talk about our values and our ethics in a perhaps a more engaging way could be really good as well.
Yeah, I thought Soper Doper coming in the other day and him saying that we need to partner with the people that care, the people like you at WaterAid. I was like, oh man, see, morality's everywhere. But I mean, when you get in your head, like I do over my research projects, it's all I think about, you start seeing it everywhere. But I also find it interesting, I've been reading that corporates are starting to question NGOs and their partnerships in that direction now, whereas NGOs used to only question the corporate side. So I think because it's kind of come full circle now, there's also more of an interest in NGOs figuring out how can they make sure that if the corporate doesn't audit of them before they partner, that they're in a good place to actually still get funding. And I think the moral side of it might be a really important piece for the corporate when they're partnering with WaterAid.
I'd say the data's probably changed hugely over the last year and a half. You, Emily, because your data was from 2014, I think, Robin, about the perception of trust. Because
there's probably 2016 now.
Yeah, the Charity Commission and the Olive Cook, everything, and that was what, 2 years ago. It's probably really quite significantly changed.
So the literature's showing that trust in charities and NGOs is dropping. And I think there's a reason because legitimacy is perception based, right? It changes over time. What constitutes or gives you legitimacy changes over time. And the mere assumption of NGOs as moral actors used to be enough, whereas now people are demanding a demonstration of NGOs' morality in order to have strong legitimacy. Louisa?
Do you see, well, first of all, thanks very much. That's really interesting and helpful. Do you see a kind of change in morals? I mean, and how that will affect you? Because kind of that prioritization of certain things are changing in public perception. People become cynical or become more self-serving or more, and the political discourse changes and Trump becomes president. And I think because that feels to me like kind of there's a big change at the moment in that kind of exactly moral and ethical kind of stuff that's going on. The migrants, it's really actually challenging some of the kind of things that you might have thought were sort of humanity.
Yeah, well, there's Peter Singer. He's one of the most famous philosophical writers on the concept of charity, for example. That's kind of his thing, is like people are desensitized. They're becoming desensitized. It's like if we're constantly being elicited, or media is trying to constantly elicit a moral response from us, eventually we don't react to those attempts to elicit a response, So definitely there's changing perceptions of morality in general, but I think that's a really big question that I'm not going to try and bring into this too much. But other than what Super Duper said, there's also people carrying more. Like the reason corporate social responsibility exists as well is because shareholders have more of an interest in corporates not just being corporates anymore. So I think it goes both ways. There's pessimistic side of it and potentially positive side. Jacob?
Just a quick question on the morals and ethics that you were planning to read. Is it part of your research kind of establishing, I guess, that list of morals? And you were talking about our values, but then you were talking about also the principles that underpin our rights-based approach, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have already a list of things that you're intending to look at? Just so I know for my own information as well, in case you're talking about wanting to sit in on teams and knowing the relevance of where maybe you should.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've already got a starting point, but I'm hoping that I learn as I go, and new things will emerge. So definitely values to start with, definitely principles underpinning the human rights-based approach, definitely the enriched pairs principles. Those are my like 3 kind of starting points of moral norms that are going to guide my analysis. But I'm hoping that as I do document review and I chat to people, I might learn that, oh wait, actually we're taking on board some of these values as well, so I might start looking at them. So I guess I want to get a comprehensive understanding of what are the values and moral norms at WaterAid being used, what are the systems of ethical thinking as well, so like the theoretical ethical thinking of WaterAid at an institutional level versus team level versus practitioner level, and then what does this all mean, or how does it translate into practice? Yeah. Margaret?
I'm just wondering if, I'm a little bit back to your note